My name is Naomi Carter. At my brother's graduation, my father stood at the podium and said, "At least one of our children made us proud." The room laughed like it was just a clever line. I didn't. I sat in the back, quiet, with the key to my Lamborghini resting in my palm, a life I built without their permission. I didn't drive 10 hours to be acknowledged. I came to remind them of what they tried to erase. And when I pressed that fob and the car blinked to life, they finally looked. If you've ever been the invisible one in your own family, stay with me, because sometimes silence makes the loudest return. And if any part of this story feels like yours, leave a comment and hit subscribe, because we're not staying invisible anymore. The air inside the auditorium smelled like fresh flowers and future plans. Rows of parents sat proudly and upright, adjusting ties and camera angles, all waiting for their child's name to be called. I sat near the back, legs crossed at the ankle, hands folded gently in my lap. From this distance, I could see the shape of my family, 3 rows ahead, my father in his navy suit, my mother with her signature silk scarf, and Ethan, glowing under the house lights with a gold valedictorian sash draped across his shoulders. Then came the voice. "Dr. Robert Carter," the announcer boomed. "Class of '92 and proud parent of this year's valedictorian, Ethan Carter." Applause erupted. Heads turned, eyes sparkled. I stayed perfectly still. My father rose with surgical precision, the same calm authority he carried into every operating room. He didn't glance back at me, not even once. At the podium, he adjusted his cufflinks like they mattered more than breath. Then began. "Being a physician is about precision," he said, "and raising a child who becomes one is no less exacting." The audience chuckled, charmed. I'd heard this speech before. Variations of it had danced through galas, donor dinners, and hospital newsletters. But this time, it wasn't general, it was a direct coronation, and I wasn't invited. He spoke about Ethan's curiosity, his discipline, and his legacy of excellence. The word legacy tasted like rust. Then it came. "At least one of our children made us proud." No pause, no softening, just a line dropped like a surgical tool. Cold, exact, irreversible. There was no gasp, no awkward silence, just polite, knowing laughter, like they all understood the context. An inside joke I never signed up for. I didn't move, didn't flinch. I kept my expression neutral, like I hadn't just been carved out of my own story. My mother clapped delicately, her eyes fixed on the stage like nothing had happened. Beside me, Sophie, my youngest sister, sat frozen. She didn't look at me, but for one moment, her hand reached over, touched mine, quiet, intentional. Then it was gone. Ethan never turned around. I didn't blame him. I wouldn't have either. No one knew. Not a single person in that polished, climate-controlled room knew about the key resting in my palm. A black Lamborghini fob, edges worn smooth from months of use. No initials, no family crest. Just mine. I hadn't driven from Chicago to compete. I came for Ethan, for Sophie, maybe even for myself. And when the applause swelled again, I stayed seated. Watching from a distance they had always kept me in. Only now, the distance wasn't emotional. It was strategic. The crowd inside the auditorium faded to a low, elegant hum as I stepped outside, just past the side exit. A narrow sloped path led down to the lot where I'd parked. The air was warmer here, quieter. Just the distant chirp of birds and the hush of late spring leaves brushing against each other. My heels moved slowly across the pavement. I wasn't in a rush. The car waited for me beneath the oaks, tucked in the far corner like a secret I no longer had to keep. It shimmered in the sunlight, deep black, polished to near glass. Most people assumed I bought it to show off. Let them. They didn't know what it meant to hand over a cashier's check with only your name on it. No co-signers, no borrowed credibility. Just me. What they didn't see was that before this, before Metasphere AI became something anyone took seriously, I lived in a basement studio in Chicago with no windows and 3 locks on the front door. The kind of place you didn't decorate, because you didn't know how long you'd survive it. I'd left med school during my 3rd year, not with fanfare, not even with rebellion. Just silence. I stopped going, stopped answering, and when I finally called home to explain, My father listened for less than 2 minutes before saying, "Naomi, you are wasting your bloodline." Then the line went dead. I didn't call again. Metasphere wasn't a company, not at first. It was a coping mechanism, a sketch on a whiteboard, a frustration born in the break room of my clinical rotation, watching another nurse scramble too late. I'd asked myself, what if we knew sooner? What if we had a system that saw the signs before we did? My professor called it ambitious, bordering on delusional. I smiled and said thank you. Then I built it anyway. The first prototype cost more than I had, so I borrowed against my future, maxed out cards, and sold what little I owned. I worked temp jobs, receptionist, a data entry, and even lab assistant for a pediatric dentist who never learned my name. Nights were for coding. Mornings were for wondering if I'd made a mistake too big to undo. When I couldn't make payroll the first time, I mortgaged the apartment. I was down to a folding chair, a mattress on the floor, and a fridge full of dollar store leftovers. That same week, my father deleted me from the family group chat. I didn't ask to come back. 4 years later, 3 major hospital systems had signed with us. Just last month, we secured Series C funding. A week ago, I hired our 40th employee, and yesterday, Forbes published a headline I read twice before believing the quiet revolution in patient safety. This morning, I left Chicago before sunrise. The city was still half asleep, the streets dotted with delivery trucks and joggers, the sky just brushing the edge of dawn. I rolled down the windows, let the silence stretch out and settle around me. It wasn't about being seen, it was about being real. And now, as I stood there watching the black finish of my Lamborghini catch the late morning sun, I knew exactly why I came. Not to prove anything, not even to forgive. I came because I could. Because this time, I wasn't the daughter who disappointed them. I was the woman they forgot to account for. They were already lined up when I returned to the lawn. My mother stood in the center, smoothing the front of her navy silk dress like it might wrinkle under the weight of the moment. Ethan stood tall beside her, still glowing from the ceremony. My father was at the other end, directing the photographer with the precision of a surgical lead. Tilt this way, shift that arm, watch the light. Sophie hovered near the back, phone in hand, her eyes scanning everything except the camera. I paused just a few feet away, letting them finish arranging themselves before my mother finally noticed me. "Naomi," she called, brisk and almost surprised. "Come join the family photo." She didn't smile. She never did when I showed up unannounced. I stepped forward without hesitation, standing beside Sophie as the photographer raised his camera. I felt the moment tighten before anyone said a word. And then came the familiar cut. "Maybe put Naomi on the end," my mother said lightly, adjusting her tone to match the breeze. "Her dress doesn't quite match the rest of the palette. I was wearing cream linen. Everyone else was in navy, blush, or charcoal, soft, cool tones. Unspoken coordination, a silent agreement I hadn't been invited to. I looked down at my dress, then back up, and nodded. Of course, wouldn't want to ruin the aesthetic. I moved quietly to the far edge, anchoring the left side of the frame. Sophie gave me a glance, neutral, unreadable, but her hand found mine again for just a second, the same gesture from the auditorium. Wordless recognition. A line between us they couldn't crop out. The photographer made small adjustments, angled my father's chin, shifted Ethan's robe, and nudged me half a step farther left. I didn't resist. I knew how this went. 3 years ago, they sent out holiday cards using a photo from my cousin's wedding. I had stood at the edge of that picture, too. When the card arrived in the mail, I wasn't in it, or rather, part of me was, my arm, just barely visible at the edge of the cropped frame. A sliver of evidence that I had been there, quickly forgotten. No one said anything. No one apologized. They just sent the cards like nothing was missing. "Say cheese," the photographer called. I smiled, the kind I'd practiced in mirrors and meeting rooms. Polished, polite, neutral. They took a few more shots, my mother tilting her head between each one, my father checking his watch between clicks. When the photographer asked for just the graduates and proud parents, I stepped back on instinct. It wasn't stated, but it was understood. I watched from a few feet away as they posed without me. Ethan in the middle, my father's hand on his shoulder. My mother is holding her clutch just so, behind them, in the glass window of the alumni building. I caught my own reflection, calm, composed, and removed. Not excluded. Not anymore. Just no longer asking to be included. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't dared name until now. I wasn't angry. I was done. Done contorting myself to fit into frames where I was never meant to belong. Done waiting to be invited. Approved. Remembered. They could keep their symmetry, their color palette, and their perfect crop. I had already stepped out of the picture, and I wasn't going back in. 3 days passed before I saw him again. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the city felt heavy with late spring haze and every meeting ran 10 minutes longer than it should. I was catching up on emails when Jasmine, my CO, poked her head in. "Your brother's here," she said. One eyebrow raised. "Looks conflicted." I blinked. "Ethan." She nodded, wearing a conference badge and a face like someone just canceled Christmas. "Send him in." He walked in slowly, messenger bag slung across one shoulder like a shield. His tie was loosened, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there on graduation day. He looked older, but also like he hadn't decided whether to keep pretending. "Nice view," he said, nodding toward the skyline outside my office window. "Didn't realize you had the whole floor." "I don't," I replied, "just the side with better light." He smiled faintly, more habit than emotion, and dropped into the chair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He was waiting for permission to begin. I gave it to him, in silence. "I've been thinking," he finally said, "about everything." I closed my laptop. "Okay." He hesitated, glancing down at his hands. "About Hopkins, the residency. Whether I'm actually doing it for me." The words hit harder than I let show. Ethan had always been the golden child, the compliant one, the perfect mold. "What makes you ask that?" I said gently. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low. "I think I chose neurosurgery because it was the hardest thing in the room. Because Dad would approve. Because if I did it well enough, no one would ask what I really wanted." I didn't interrupt. "I did a rotation in pediatric oncology last month," he continued. "And it felt different. Like I was doing something human. Not just prestigious. Not just precise. It mattered. The way he said it. Soft but sure. Told me this wasn't a passing thought. It was a truth long denied. Finally finding air. "So what's stopping you?" I asked. He looked up, eyes clear but uncertain. "You already know." I did. "Because Dad will say I'm wasting potential. Because Mom will cry and call it a phase. Because I've been their legacy project for so long. I don't know who I am without their applause." I stood and walked around the desk, not to take control, but to sit beside him instead of across. "Do you remember when I told them I was leaving med school?" He nodded slowly. "They acted like I'd died." "I remember," he whispered. "I didn't even know what I was building yet. All I knew was that I couldn't live with the version of myself I was becoming." He didn't speak, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle crack in the performance he'd been perfecting his whole life. Then he looked at me, voice barely above a breath. "Would you support me?" he asked. If I walked away from all of it, I didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need." He exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath for 3 years. "Okay then," he said, voice steadier now. "I think I need to make a call." And for the first time, I saw Ethan, not the version polished for our parents, not the curated son at the center of the photo, just him, choosing himself. Ethan paced the edge of my balcony like he was walking the perimeter of something about to break. His phone was in one hand, the other clenched and unclenched with every few steps, like his body couldn't decide whether to brace for impact or prepare to fight back. He'd been rehearsing the conversation for over an hour, half sentences, deep breaths, pauses that never landed. But we both knew no script could soften the words he needed to say. I stayed inside, letting him have the space, letting him make the choice. Just after 8, he stopped walking, stared out over the city, and pressed call. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I didn't need to. "Hey," Dad, he said. The tone dropped almost immediately, not in volume, but in weight. That familiar gravity our father carried into every conversation, every decision, a surgeon's precision, even when dismantling his children. I wanted to talk about the residency, Ethan began, voice steady, about Hopkins. He paused, listening. His posture stiffened. No, I haven't changed my mind, he said. That's why I'm calling. I watched him from the doorway, hands in my lap, saying nothing. I've decided to defer, he continued. I'm pursuing pediatric oncology. It's not a backup. It's not a phase. It's where I actually feel like I'm doing something that matters. Another long silence. I could almost feel the chill in my father's reply through Ethan's spine. If that means losing your financial support, I'll manage, he said. His hand tightened around the railing. No, he added firmly. This isn't about Naomi. He looked straight ahead, the city lights flickering against his reflection in the balcony glass. This is about me, he said. I'm not walking away from medicine, Dad. I'm walking toward the part of it that actually makes sense to me. Then, quietly, with finality, he ended the call. No drawn-out goodbye, no hopeful pause, just silence, and the phone resting heavy in his hand. I stepped outside and handed him the glass of water I'd poured earlier. He took it without looking, drank half, and sat down on the bench. Cut off, I asked gently. He nodded, financially, emotionally, symbolically, the full package. He didn't cry, didn't even blink hard, but I knew what it cost him to stand there and not fold. My phone buzzed. I glanced down. It was Sophie. Sophie Dad's storming around like it's DEFCON 1. Mom's pretending to cry. He keeps saying, first Naomi. Now Ethan like it's a disease. I turned the screen toward Ethan. He gave a faint, bitter smile. Guess we're both contagious. I sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. It's weird, he said. It hurts, but it also feels right. It is right, I replied. He didn't answer, but the way he sat up straighter told me he was starting to believe it. And I didn't need to say anything else, because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can offer is presence. And this time, it was his turn to be seen, on his terms. We sat on the balcony long after the call had ended. The city stretched below us in soft amber light, windows blinking like quiet heartbeats, unaware that something tectonic had just shifted in our small corner of the world. Ethan leaned back against the bench, glass resting loosely in his hand, breathing steadier than before. No more pacing, no more rehearsing, just stillness, earned, and long overdue. My phone buzzed again. Same contact. Sophie. I opened the message. Dad's yelling, like actually yelling. Mom's still doing her fake cry thing. He keeps saying, first Naomi, now Ethan, like we're some kind of contagious mental illness. I stared at the screen for a moment, not shocked, just tired. Then I turned it toward Ethan. He read it silently, and for a split second, I braced for something heavier. A sigh, a wince, a flicker of regret. But what came instead was a quiet, almost amused exhale. He looked at me, smiled, dry and knowing, contagious. I raised an eyebrow. Apparently. And then, we both laughed. Not the kind of laugh that bursts from joy, but the kind that escapes from recognition. The kind that comes when you realize you're no longer carrying the shame they tried to assign you. It wasn't a disease we were passing on. It was clarity. They called it defiance. We knew better. It was a refusal to keep performing someone else's version of our lives. I leaned back beside him, our shoulders brushing like a quiet promise. There was no need to explain the message or what it meant. It was obvious now in their eyes. I had become the starting point, the origin of dissent, the one who infected the structure with doubt, with independence, with truth. And they weren't wrong. What they feared most wasn't losing control. It was what that loss would reveal, that their love had always been conditional, that their legacy was built on silence, that if one of us stepped out of line, the rest might follow. I looked at Ethan, not the golden sun they'd raised to shine for them, but the man now dimming their spotlight with his own choices. He caught my gaze and shook his head gently. It's strange, he said. When I was a kid, I thought if I ever disappointed them, I'd feel like I was drowning. And now I asked. He paused. Now it feels like breathing. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophie. They're trying to figure out who else knows. Who else might be infected? Mom asked if I've been talking to you more lately. I told her you sent me a funny dog video once. I smiled. A soft ache blooming behind my ribs. Sophie was still inside their world, but the cracks were spreading. She saw it. She felt it. And now she knew she wasn't the only one. I didn't reply. Didn't need to. She knew I'd seen it, and she knew I was here. Later that night, as Ethan fell asleep on my couch, still half in formal clothes, half wrapped in an old throw blanket, I sat beside him and watched the city through the window. They could call it rebellion. They could call it a phase. But we knew. It was healing. And if that made us contagious, so be it. The morning after Ethan made the call, I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the quiet rise of light outside my window. He was still asleep on the couch, breathing slowly, a little tangled in the throw blanket, like someone who hadn't truly rested in years. The stillness felt earned, and I wasn't in a hurry to disturb it. I opened my laptop, expecting nothing more than the usual follow-ups from Jasmine, platform bug reports, and a few investor pings. But there it was. An unread email is near the top of my inbox. Subject line: Strategic Collaboration Proposal, Riverside West Hospital. My breath paused, not because of the name, but because of the signature at the bottom. Dr. Monica Reeves, Chief of Innovation, Riverside West Hospital, my father's hospital. I clicked it open, bracing for the usual back-channel introduction, the subtle favor, the half-implied nudge that said this is coming from him. But there was none of that. No mention of my father, no CC, no familiar phrasing or emotional leverage. Just a direct, formal invitation to explore a pilot implementation of Metasphere's real-time deterioration tracking platform. They cited our published outcomes, our safety metrics, our recent funding round. It was clinical, precise, professional, and it was entirely mine. For a long moment, I just sat there, reading and rereading the lines, letting the weight of it settle. A year ago, this would have torn something open in me. I would have wondered, did he finally change his mind? Did he soften? Did he send this through someone else so I wouldn't refuse it outright? But that wasn't what this was. This wasn't a handout. It was recognition. Earned. Not inherited. I highlighted the email and forwarded it to Jasmine with a simple note. Let's move forward. Loop legal in. Then I closed my laptop and let myself feel the quiet. Not joy. Not vindication. Just fullness. Like something that had been frayed for too long had finally been tied off. I looked over at Ethan, still dozing. One hand tucked under his jaw. The shadows under his eyes were softer now. His chest rose and fell like the weight of the last 24 hours had finally eased. There was a time I thought the only way to earn my father's attention was to prove I was just like him. Precise, composed, surgical in both thought and ambition. But now, the hospital bearing his legacy had reached out, not for who I used to be, for what I'd built without him, and that was enough. Later that afternoon, Sophie texted again. Your startup made the news bulletin at school. Local anchor. Blurred your face on the banner. But Dad turned the volume down halfway through. Mom asked if you were going to the gala in October. I laughed, quietly and genuinely. 5 whole months of pretending I'm not dead, I thought. That might be a new record. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let the silence hold. They hadn't said my name out loud. But the world was starting to, and this time, it wasn't in relation to his. That evening, after the email from Riverside West had been forwarded, logged, and archived, I sat by the window in my apartment with the lights dimmed and the city humming low in the distance. Ethan had gone back to his place with a quiet promise to keep breathing on his own. The apartment felt still again, but not lonely. My phone buzzed once. FaceTime Sophie Carter. I stared at the screen for a second, then answered. Her face appeared, framed by soft hoodie sleeves pulled halfway over her hands. Her hair was piled in a messy bun, backlit by the warm glow of her bedroom lamp. You're on our news bulletin, she said, without preamble. Then she turned the camera toward the TV. The anchor was mid-segment. My name flashing across a side banner. Local startup redefines ICU safety standards. My face was blurred in the corner, but the logo, the data, and the headline were clear. Sophie turned the screen back to herself. Dad turned the volume down halfway through. I gave a soft smile. That tracks. Mom asked if you're going to the gala in October. 5 months of silence, and she breaks it for a dress code, I said dryly. Sophie laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a while, but then something in her expression shifted. A pause, a glance downward. I've been thinking, she said, softer now, about college, about Duke. I didn't say anything. I let her find the shape of the sentence. I know it's impressive, the kind of school they like putting in holiday letters. But I don't know if I actually want to go there. I don't even know if I want pre-law. She looked at me then. Really looked. And I saw it. That quiet ache of someone at a crossroads. Terrified of choosing wrong, but more terrified of never choosing for herself. I think, she whispered. I only ever picked Duke because they made it sound like the right kind of success. I nodded once, not to guide her, just to let her know I understood. And now I asked. She hesitated. Now I don't know what I want, but I think that's still more honest than pretending I do. I let a breath out slowly, leaning closer to the screen. You don't have to live the story they wrote for you. Sophie blinked but didn't look away. You can write your own, I said. Start from scratch, scribble in the margins. Tear out whole chapters if you have to. You don't owe them an ending that makes them proud. Just one that makes you free. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then if I ever write that story, I'm putting you in the acknowledgements. I smiled. Just spell my name right. She laughed again, then wiped at her eye like it was nothing. The call ended a few minutes later, but the moment lingered. I sat with it, letting it settle into the silence like a note that didn't need to resolve. Sophie was still inside their house, their orbit, their narrative, but she was starting to imagine life outside it. And sometimes, that's all it takes. A single breath in the right direction, a different kind of legacy. The ballroom shimmered with gold light, velvet drapes, marble floors, crystal chandeliers so bright they almost made you forget how cold these rooms could be. It was the kind of space where names weren't just printed on programs. They were carved into reputations. The Legacy in Medicine Gala, an annual performance where people came not to be inspired, but to be confirmed. My father, Dr. Robert Carter, was the evening's honoree. 30 years of surgical advancement, leadership, and mentorship to a generation of future healers. His name was embossed on every cover. His bio stretched an entire page. My name wasn't mentioned. I hadn't expected it to be. I didn't come for that. I came because this time, I wasn't entering the room as someone's daughter. I was entering as someone who had built something real, something that no one could crop out. Jasmine walked beside me, sharp as ever in a custom-cut navy suit. Her presence grounded me. We found our seats near the middle, nowhere near the front, but not tucked in the back either, right where we chose to be. As we walked through the crowd, heads turned, not dramatically, not like in the movies, but enough to feel it. The double takes, the careful smiles. The men who once called me Dr. Carter's daughter now paused longer before speaking, as if weighing my name differently. When the program began, I listened quietly. No bitterness, just clarity. My father took the stage like he always had, composed, elegant, in command. He spoke about discipline, about legacy, about boundaries pushed and standards upheld. The room applauded at all the right moments. I sipped my drink and let the words wash over me. Not because they moved me, but because I finally understood they were never meant for me. He hadn't changed, but I had. After the speech, the mingling began. People formed clusters around him, shaking hands, offering flattery, retelling stories they'd all heard before. I stayed back, observing. There was a time I would have searched for an opening, waited for him to acknowledge me, to see me, to say something that proved I still had a place in his constellation. But not tonight. Jasmine leaned in. They keep asking if you're going to speak. I smiled. Let them wonder. At one point, I passed a group of former colleagues, surgeons who used to pat me on the shoulder and ask if I'd thought about reapplying to med school. One of them looked at me now like I'd become something he couldn't quite categorize. Not disruptive, not dismissible, just undeniable. Before we left, I paused by the photo display near the foyer. Dozens of framed moments from my father's career. Handshakes, award ceremonies, black and white candids from early residency, in one image. He stood in his scrubs outside an OR, arms crossed, jaw set in that familiar way. No caption, no context, just a man who'd mastered control. And here I was, years later, standing across from that frame, no longer needing his permission, no longer hoping to be included. As Jasmine and I stepped into the car, I didn't look back at the ballroom, not at the light, not at the spotlight, not at him. Because this night wasn't about being seen, it was about seeing clearly. I didn't approach him, not once, not after the applause, not during the handshakes, not when the CEO of the hospital placed a hand on his back like he was some living monument. I let the crowd orbit him the way they always had. Let them quote his lines about precision, about legacy. Let them recall surgeries he no longer remembered and praise a mentorship he offered only to those who mirrored him. I stayed near the edge of the room, close enough to hear, far enough to choose silence. And it was enough. No speech, no toast, no performance, just presence. That night, my value didn't come from what I said or where I sat. It came from what I no longer needed. They kept asking Jasmine if I was going to say a few words, whispered to each other as they adjusted their ties or checked their watches. A few came by and smiled, testing the water with questions about Metasphere's latest results. I answered politely. I didn't linger, let them wonder. Toward the end of the evening, I wandered back to the photo display near the entrance, a curated collage of the man they were celebrating. One image caught my attention, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. It showed him in his early 30s, standing just outside an operating room. His arms were crossed. His eyes, though youthful, held the same weight I'd known my whole life. No smile, no caption, just control, in another frame. He was holding Ethan as a baby, one hand cradling the back of his head, the other gesturing mid-sentence, probably explaining something medical to someone off camera. And besides that, a photo from a conference gala 15 years ago. Everyone is in formal wear. My mother is in deep red, Ethan in a clip-on bow tie. Sophie has not yet been born. I wasn't in that one, and I didn't need to be, because something had shifted, not in them, but in me. I no longer scanned these images looking for proof that I belonged. I didn't tilt my head, wondering if I'd been cropped out, or if I'd ever truly been there. Now, I looked at them with stillness, with clarity. They told the story they wanted to tell, and I was no longer asking to be part of it. I stepped back from the display, adjusted the sleeve of my dress, and turned toward the exit where Jasmine waited with the car. We didn't say much on the ride home. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was clean. It felt like exhaling after a decade of holding my breath. Not because anyone gave me permission, but because I'd finally stopped asking for it. A few days passed. No calls, no fallout, just a quiet absence that settled like dust in a room no one bothered to sweep. Then, late one evening, my phone buzzed. It was a photo from Sophie. No caption, just the image, the living room, the bookshelf. Same one that had stood in the corner of our childhood home for as long as I could remember. Lined with thick medical texts, surgical casebooks, and hardcover biographies of men who looked like our father and spoke like him. Too. But this time, something had changed. 3 copies of Vanguard Health magazine sat neatly arranged along the top shelf. The most recent issue, the one with my face on the cover dot, is positioned beside Cerebral Precision, a memoir by Dr. Robert Carter. Not tucked in, not hidden, not placed spine in. Like an afterthought, displayed, visible, undeniable. No one had said a word, not Sophie, not my parents, no congratulations, no complaints, just that photo. And it was enough. Because for the first time, they hadn't cropped me out, they hadn't erased me, they hadn't pretended I wasn't real. I stared at the image for a long time, not searching for what it meant, just letting it exist. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt finished. Like a wound that had finally closed without stitches. Like the silence didn't hurt anymore because it was no longer misunderstood. It wasn't rejection. It was released. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit until now. There was a version of me that had once waited, year after year, to be seen by the people who taught me how to disappear. She wasn't waiting anymore. She'd stopped knocking, stopped hoping. And maybe that was what healing actually looked like. Not some grand apology or public reckoning, but a photo, a shelf, a name in print, finally allowed to exist beside theirs. No applause, no fanfare, no forced pride, just quiet recognition. And after everything, that was enough. The restaurant was tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner on a quiet street in the West Loop. No grand sign, no wait list, just warm lighting, soft music, and the scent of garlic and roasted tomatoes slipping through the air like memory. Ethan picked the place. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't check for parental availability. He just booked a table. Jasmine joined us. Sharp as ever in a blazer she probably designed herself. We ordered a bottle of wine that none of us could pronounce and laughed when the cork popped too loudly. No cameras, no press, no expectation, just a table, 3 chairs, and the space to be who we were. Ethan set his phone face down before the bread even arrived. I deferred officially, he said. Tone light but steady. They were surprised, but they respected it. And Dad, I asked, though I already knew. He paused, still silent. I raised my glass, to breathe without permission. He clinked his glass against mine. Jasmine joined in. Then he grinned. Sophie says she wants to start a Carter Family Outcasts Club. You and me as co-founders. I laughed. Do we get jackets, custom embroidery? He said, unapologetically disappointing since 2018. We laughed until the waiter brought appetizers. And even then, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was real. Later that night, Sophie sent me another photo, the bookshelf again. But this time, the magazine had been moved, centered, framed in a clear acrylic stand. Still no caption, still no words. But it didn't need any. She was watching, and maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe she could write a life of her own. Not to prove a point, not to win approval, but because freedom isn't loud, it's steady, it's showing up, again and again, until your presence becomes undeniable. As we left the restaurant, Jasmine slipped her arm through mine. You look lighter, she said. I feel finished, I replied. Not closed, not hardened, just whole. And as I walked past the street lamps and storefronts, the night casting long shadows behind me, I didn't glance back. I didn't need the spotlight, because I wasn't trying to be seen anymore. I was finally being myself, and I was never going to ask permission for that again. If you've ever had to find your way out of someone else's story to finally live your own, you're not alone. Leave a comment if you've ever been made to feel invisible, and hit subscribe if you're done asking for permission to be seen.